Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Liane. I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. I want to welcome you today. We're going to be seeing Peter Small, a historical impressionist. He is going to be Thomas Edison today, the inventor. Peter Small has performed for national audiences at the Ronald Reagan, Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and George Bush presidential libraries. He's also appeared on the History Channel. Small will portray Thomas Jefferson, who you should know invented the electric light bulb, phonograph, and motion pictures.
Well, good morning, and how are you doing today? Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you very well. You'll have to forgive me, I haven't been able to hear a bird sing since I was 12, but I'll tell you about that later. Well, I'm very delighted to welcome you here at my laboratory here in West Orange, New Jersey. We're not far from New York City or Newark, New Jersey, and I'm sure you're familiar with many things that I invented, such as the electric incandescent lamp. This, of course, is probably my most famous invention, but it's not my only one. I also invented the phonograph, or many of you call it the record player, and I know this is how you still listen to music today, correct? What? Don't you play music at home, or do you have a better idea? Then you do. You come and work for me, and we'll invent that. Motion pictures. Not just did I invent the motion picture camera, the motion picture projector, and a viewing machine that I will show you later called the kinetoscope. I also invented a talking doll. I invented the fluoroscope, the screen for the X-ray, Portland cement, a process to make rubber from goldenrod, an electric railway, electric dynamos, generators. I also invented a vote recording machine, the mimeograph machine. I improved the typewriter, the telephone, and the telegraph. In total, I had a total of about 1,093 patents on inventions. Yes, thank you. And I have been told that is still a record with the United States Patent Office. Now, I understand back in the 1890s, the director of the Patent Office said that everything that needed to be invented had been invented. Well, good thing I couldn't hear him very well. But my greatest invention is right here in West Orange. I call it the Invention Factory. Oh, you see, what I do is I bring in lots of people to work for me. I call them my muckers, and what we do is we work on making inventions. So usually we come up with a minor invention about every 10 days and a major one about every 6 months. And I understand that my competitors have been copying that idea. They call their invention factories the Research and Development Laboratory. Yes, but this is not my first invention factory. My first one was south of here in Menlo Park. That's right off of the main railroad between New York City and Philadelphia. It was there in the late 1870s and late 1880s. As I said, I had my first invention factory. That's where we perfected electrical lighting, and I invented the phonograph. And it also reminded me of my first marriage. Oh, no, she was a lovely young girl. When I first met my first wife, her brother was an employee of mine, and her name was Mary Stillwell, and she came to work for me at my first factory in Newark, New Jersey, over on Ward Street back in 1871. And eventually I began to court her, and we were married. And she gave birth to 3 children, my first 3 children, Marion, Tom Jr., and Will. Unfortunately, though, I found that old Fopsy Mopsy couldn't invent worth a darn. And unfortunately, in the summer of 1884, she became ill, and she never recovered. She passed away that autumn. Some people tell me it was a brain tumor. I think it was typhoid. I just hope it wasn't the same brain disease that killed my poor mother. But 2 years later, I began to court another young woman. Her name was Mina Miller. She comes from Akron, Ohio. Her father, Lewis Miller, is a very successful industrialist. And with a minister friend of his, they started a camp, a Sunday school camp somewhere in upstate New York, actually just south of Buffalo near a lake. And they have a tent there that they erect, and they have speakers come from all over the country to talk there. And they've been copying that idea in other towns and cities where they erect a tent in the middle of town and speakers come and talk there. And they named it after that lake in upstate New York. They call it Chautauqua. Well, I was courting Mina Miller, who I would affectionately call my dearest Billy, and I remember it was time to ask her the important question. And I asked her by tapping it in Morse code in her hand. Will you marry me? And she responded back, yes. And we've been married for 45 years, and we live not far from my laboratory over in Llewellyn Park. That's a gated area of West Orange, where we have a home called Glenmont. Now, the problem is I'm here at the laboratory most of the week, so she takes care of the home, as she calls herself a home executive. And she keeps an eye on the place. The problem is I'm here at the laboratory most of the time. I don't get home until the weekends, and I usually end up sleeping on tables or desks, and my dearest Billy became very upset about that, so she made me put a bed in my office here at the laboratory, and that's where I get to meet my mistress, work. Yes, but she's a wonderful woman, a very devoutly religious woman, a devout Methodist. The problem is, well, I'm really more of a free thinker. Now, I do believe there is a higher power, but I believe, unlike my dearest Billy, I don't believe the answers are in the Bible. I believe they're in science. I don't know if I told you this, but I have been working on a machine to contact the dead. This way we won't have to pray for their souls. We can just call them up. And she gave me another 3 children, a daughter Madeline, a son Charles, and the youngest son Theodore. Theodore has actually become a scientist and an inventor in his own right, and Charles started out by writing plays for those bohemians over in Greenwich Village in New York City. But my dearest Billy urged me to bring him into the business, and so I brought Charles into the business, and he'll eventually take over when I'm no longer here. And my daughter Madeline is the only one of any of my 6 children to give me grandchildren. And she married a fine gentleman named John Sloan. However, there were some problems when they got married. Well, I told you, my wife is a devout Methodist, and, well, Mr. Sloan he's Roman Catholic. Oh, yeah. But my family's own origins are right here in New Jersey. My ancestors came from England and Holland and settled here in New Jersey. Unfortunately, during the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, my family were Tories, loyalists, supporters of the king. So when the war was over, they had to flee north to Canada. That's where my parents, Nancy Elliott and Sam Edison, were born. And during the Mackenzie Rebellion in the 1830s, my father was on the losing side, so he fled south to the United States, where he settled in Milan, Ohio. That's a little town in northern Ohio between Cleveland and Toledo. That's where I was born on the 11th of February, 1847. Now, as a little boy, I was always curious about things. I'm sure when you were growing up, you were curious about things, and I'm sure as a child, your curiosity got you in trouble frequently. Oh, it got me in trouble all the time. One time, a neighbor was chopping with an axe. I got too close, and whoa, I lost part of my fingertip. Another time, I fell into a canal and nearly drowned. Then I fell into a grain elevator, almost suffocated to death. And then when I was about 5 years old, I was in the barn experimenting with fire. I think you could guess what happened to the barn, and I'm sure you could guess what my father gave me. Ooh, that hurt. Ooh, oh my. But when I was I think 3 or 4 years old, I made my first scientific discovery. Now, you know, in order to make a scientific discovery, it requires a lot of observation. Well, I was in the barn and I was observing a goose sitting on some eggs. And eventually the eggs hatched. And I made the connection. I decided I would try the same thing. It obviously didn't work. And I discovered that I have to be some sort of fowl if I'm going to hatch an egg. Now, when I was 7, our family moved up to Port Huron in Michigan. Unfortunately, I was ill for a year with scarlet fever, and so I wasn't able to start school until I was 8 years old. Now, back in the 1850s, when I was growing up, if you went to school, you attended one of these one-room schoolhouses, and I attended one that was run by a Reverend Engel. Well, the problem with Reverend Engel was he believed in teaching us by rote and memorization. The problem is I don't learn by memorizing. That's boring. I learn by observing and by doing. And as a result, I didn't learn anything in his class. Well, he was boring. Well, I so frustrated him after several months, I overheard him one day say that nothing would come out of that Edison boy. He was addled in the mind. Well, I ran home and I told my mother. Well, bless my mother. You see, before my mother was married, she was a school teacher. She knew I could learn, but she knew that I needed and required individual attention. So what did she do? She took me out of school and taught me at home. She taught me reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and 2 subjects I've always enjoyed. I'm sure you can guess what they are. Science and math. Oh, no, not math. I can hire mathematicians. They can't hire me. I have to tell you a story. I once hired 2 college-educated men, university degrees, and I said, gentlemen, what is the volume of water that fits inside this electric light bulb or lamp? Do you know they spent all day working on their formulas? At the end of the day, they still didn't have an answer. So I filled it with water, I poured it into a measured beaker, and I said, that's your answer. Now, my 2 favorite subjects were science and chemistry. But bless my mother, she made learning fun. She made it interesting. She had faith and confidence in me when nobody else did. Why, I was so dedicated to my studies that during the summer, when my friends were off for the summer, I would be out playing with them. I'd interrupt and I'd say, excuse me, fellas, I have to go home for studies. That's how dedicated I was. Why, by the time I was 11 years old, I discovered a place in town where I could read up on all sorts of things. The local library. Oh, I read books like Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, the writings of Thomas Paine, and many others, and anything I could find on science and chemistry. And then when I was 11 years old, I started something new in the basement of our house. I started my own chemistry laboratory where I would experiment with all sorts of chemicals. Well, one day I read in a book that gases cause balloons to rise. So in my fertile 11-year-old mind, I thought to myself, I know what I'll do. I'll make a mixture of gases, I'll have someone drink it, and then they can rise like a balloon. Well, that's exactly what I did. I took something called Sedlitz powder that made gas bubbles. I gave it to a childhood friend of mine, Michael Oates. He drank it. And did he rise like a balloon? No, he went right to the ground with a stomach ache, and then my mother punished me that evening. But when I was 12, I needed to earn more money to buy more chemicals for my laboratory. So I got a job on the Grand Trunk Railway. That's the main railroad between Port Huron and Detroit in Michigan. And I got a job as what they call a butch. It meant a news butch or a candy butch. I would sell candy and newspapers to the passengers on the train. And in my spare time, in the rear of the train, in the baggage compartment, I did 2 things. One, I printed a newspaper. And I'm told by many people this was the first newspaper ever printed on a moving train. And you have to realize I was just 12 and 13 years old at the time that I was printing this. I also continued with my chemistry experiments. But you know, those old trains, they're kind of rickety and shaky, and if they shook too much, then those chemicals would spill. And one day, the sulfur spilled and caught on fire. Well, you can imagine the conductor's reaction when he saw that. I mean, after all, what would you do if a 12 or 13-year-old's chemicals caught fire on your train? So at the next train station, he took me and my chemicals and threw me off the train. And I recall he grabbed me by my ears and boxed me like this. Or was it the time I was running to catch the train and he pulled me up on my ears? I don't know. I'd been pulled and boxed on my ears so many times when I was young that one day when I was 12, I heard a snap, and I realized that I was losing my hearing. And since that day, I haven't even been able to hear a bird sing. But you know what? Even though I don't hear well, and by the way, I never even went to high school or college or had the same opportunities and privileges that many of you have had, it never stopped me from trying to figure out how things work. Well, one day when I was 15, I was working at another train station. It was Mount Clemens, so that's between Port Huron and Detroit. I was standing there on the platform when a little boy crawled out on the track. Well, I quickly ran. I grabbed the little boy and saved him from an oncoming freight train. Well, the little boy's father was Mr. Mackenzie, the station master. He was so thankful and so grateful I saved his young son's life. He gave me a new job and a new career that would change my life. Of course, you all recognize this. This is the telegraph, the fastest form of communication before the invention of the telephone and the radio, and in the 1860s, the most advanced use of technology at that time. Well, I was fascinated with the telegraph. How did it work? How can I improve it? And what can I make from it? Well, I began to, after all, we were still learning about, after all, what made the telegraph work? It was electricity, and it introduced me to the principles of electricity. But we still had a lot to learn. But as I said, I was fascinated with this, and I wanted to know how it could work, how could I improve it, and what could I make from it? Well, beginning in my teen years and into my early adult years, I would work as a telegraph operator at many locations throughout Michigan, Ontario in Canada, Ohio and Kentucky, Tennessee, eventually making my way down to New Orleans and Louisiana. And I had many different experiences. I recall one of my first jobs, it was as a telegrapher, it was in Ontario, Canada. And I had this supervisor who was impossible. He expected all of us operators, to send him an S message that was 3 dots every hour on the hour. Well, I needed to catch up on my sleep, so I had an idea. I made an automatic relay, my first invention. It would automatically send out an S signal, 3 dots every hour on the hour. And it worked. And he was impressed with my promptness. So much so that he wanted to come out and inspect me, unannounced. And he came out and he found out why I was so prompt. He also found out the reason I invented it, because he caught me sleeping on the job, and as a result of my ingenuity, I was fired. But by the time I was 21, I made my way down to New Orleans, and with some friends, I was going to travel with them to South America. Unfortunately, I became ill and couldn't join them. But I needed to find some more steady and more gainful employment, and I found out they needed experienced telegraph operators up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I made my way there. And for a while, I worked in a factory owned by Mr. Charles Williams, and it was there I was able to improve my expertise on the telegraph. I found out there were other people there doing the same thing. One of them was a young man by the name of Thomas Watson. I don't know if any of you recognize the name, but one of my competitors would hire him for his expertise on telegraphy, Alexander Graham Bell. You remember the first words Mr. Bell said on the telephone? "Mr. Watson, come here, I need you." That was him. He was a co-worker of mine. Well, by now I decided I was going to go out on my own, and I took out a press release that announced that Thomas A. Edison would now devote himself to working on inventions. I got a business partner named Bill Pope, and we advertised our expertise on telegraphy by giving ourselves a new job title, electrical engineer. And it was around this time I patented my first invention. It was a vote recording machine. It worked on telegraphic principles. The whole idea was that a legislator could sit at his desk, press a button, yay or nay, send the signal over a wire to a a piece of paper that would record it at the clerk's desk. I thought, what a wonderful way to speed up a roll call in the legislature. So I was invited by the United States House of Representatives to demonstrate my invention for them, and I did. This was in 1869, and I was just 22 years old. I demonstrated it for them, and it worked. And their response to it was, "Young man, that's exactly what we don't want. How are we going to filibuster on a roll call? How are we going to delay a roll call if we're in the minority faction? We're not going to do that to ourselves." Well, I learned two very important lessons. First of all, don't try to sell an invention to the federal government. More importantly, that if I'm ever going to invent anything, make sure there's a market for it, there's a need for it, something that people will buy. Well, I was in need of some more steady and gainful employment. And I found out they needed experienced operators down in the financial district in Lower Manhattan in New York City. I believe you folks today call it Wall Street. And I went down to one of these firms. After all, they needed someone to receive the information from the stock exchange to the firm. And telegraphy, of course, was the fastest way of doing it. Well, I went down to one of these firms that was looking for these experienced operators. But when I got there was a panic. Their transmitter had broken down. Well, I looked at the situation. I said, well, gentlemen, maybe I can help you. So I repaired their transmitter. Oh, they never did hire me as an operator. They hired me as superintendent instead. I was just 23 years old and earning $300 a week. Pretty good salary back in 1870. Absolutely. Well, working in the financial district in New York gave me some ideas. They had already invented some crude sorts of ticker tape machines. And I understood how those ticker tape machines worked. They worked on telegraphic principles, which I understood. So the next year in 1871, I invented and patented an improved ticker tape machine for the stock market. I heard there was some people interested in it. One of them was a man by the name of Marshall Lefferts. He later would become superintendent of Western Union. He was interested in my machine, and I demonstrated it to him. He was impressed, and he said, "Young man, we'd like to make you an offer." And I asked him, "Well, how much will you offer me?" He offered me $40,000, which in 1871 was a small fortune. He gave me the check. I went to the bank, cashed it, and literally was stuffing that money in my pockets. I'd never had that much money before in my life. Later on, he said to me, "You know, young man, you're not such a good businessman. If you had asked for $100,000, we would have given it to you." You know what I told him? I thought it was worth about $3,000. With that money, I opened up a factory in Newark, New Jersey on Ward Street, where I began to produce ticker tape machines for the stock market. I also began, with the profits from that, began to work on new inventions or improve existing inventions. I came up with something called the quadruplex, which was a machine that could send and receive 4 messages simultaneously on one telegraph wire, greatly speeding up telegraphic transmission. I also came up with another idea. Wax paper, but not for what you think it is. Not for food wrapping. I had another idea. I came up with something called an electric pen. It was a pen connected to a wet cell battery that could write on a sheet of wax paper and make perforated holes. You put it over a piece of paper, you roll ink over it, and you made a copy. You all know that today as the mimeograph machine. That was my invention. I was coming up with all sorts of ideas, improving the telegraph and other things. And then I came up with an idea around 1876. I thought to myself, you know, if we could send signals over wire, why can't we send voice vibrations over wire? If we can record messages, Morse code on paper, why can't we record voices the same way? So I began to get ideas about transmitting and recording sound. So in 1876, I was on the verge of inventing the telephone. But as you know, someone else beat me to it, Alexander Graham Bell. But the problem with Mr. Bell's telephone, it used a magnetic transmitter which gave a very weak signal. And of course, I couldn't hear it very well. So I replaced the magnetic transmitter with a carbon transmitter. It amplified the voice. It made the voice travel farther over the telephone. So when you think of the telephone, I want you to remember, Mr. Bell invented the telephone receiver. I invented the telephone transmitter. By the way, it's the same thing. That carbon transmitter is the same thing they use in microphones on radio today. Oh, I also came up with another idea. You know what Mr. Bell wanted the greeting on the telephone to be? Ahoy! I came up with a better idea. Hello! Well, the idea of transmitting and recording sound gave me an idea. So in 1877, I spent many months researching and designing to make a machine that could record the human voice. I drew up my ideas. I gave it to one of my assistants, John Crucy, an engineer from Switzerland, and I gave him these instructions. Make this. Well, several months later, he came back with a prototype of what I would call the phonograph. The whole idea of the phonograph is in some ways not very different from the telephone. You speak into one end and you listen on the other end. And when you would speak into it, the sound waves of the voice would vibrate a diaphragm just like in a telephone. But instead of vibrating a wire, it would vibrate a little stylus or needle, and it would make impressions of the voice pattern on a piece of tin foil that would be rotated. And once you were finished recording the patterns of your voice on that piece of tin foil, you'd crank it back, you would then crank it forward, and the impressions of your voice pattern would vibrate another stylus or needle, which would vibrate a diaphragm, and you'd hear the voice. And the first words I recorded on it were from a very famous nursery rhyme that we all know. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. I tried it, and believe it or not, it worked right the first time I tried it. None of my inventions ever worked right the first time, but the phonograph did. Not just was this my favorite invention, it was probably my most original. And in 1877, at the age of 30, it made me internationally famous. I became known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, the Napoleon of invention. I would demonstrate my phonograph all throughout the country and throughout Europe. Why, I even spent one night at the White House demonstrating it to President Hayes and his cabinet. But by 1878, I needed to take a rest, and that summer I took a vacation out in Wyoming to observe a solar eclipse. I had even invented a machine that could measure the rays and the heat of the sun during such an event. And it was around this time I was approached by several investors about working on a new project that we would call the subdivision of light. You would all know it as the electric incandescent lamp or the electric light bulb. Now something I need to clarify with you. I did not invent electrical lighting. I perfected it. We knew electricity could make light even before I was born. Why, 40 years before I was born in England, Sir Humphrey Davy proved with a little carbon arc you could actually make create a little bit of electric light. The problem was there was no way to make it long-lasting and sustaining. And over the years, many people had tried and failed in trying to make a longer-lasting electric lamp. By the 1870s, there actually were some forms of electrical lighting. Over in Paris, France, they had something called arc lighting. The problem with arc lighting was it gave off gas and heat and could be used only on a limited basis outdoors. And the problem with that was all those lights worked in what were called a series, which meant that if one lamp went out, they all went out. Well, I wanted to come up with an incandescent filament that could be safely used indoors and to come up with a system of parallel circuits. After all, we had gas. Many places were now beginning to use gas lamps in their homes. If you could turn a gas jet off in one room and on in another, why couldn't we do the same with electricity? Well, eventually we would develop those parallel circuits, but more importantly, we had to come up with that filament. Now, of course, when we think of electricity, we think of the most obvious conductor of electricity, metal. And we experimented with every single known metal, every known element, every known alloy, every known wire. None of them gave us the results that we were looking for. Although we did get some good results with platinum, but that was too expensive. We wanted to find something that was practical and economical. Well, what I realized from observing these experiments, why those lamps went out quickly, I realized was that the filaments we were using had low resistance and required high energy. So I thought to myself, let's reverse it. Let's use low energy and high resistance, because you see, electricity flows like water. Now, think of a large lake or a wide river when it suddenly comes to a gorge. The river will narrow, but the water will flow. What was slow-flowing water will suddenly flow very quickly through a narrow gorge. Electricity does the same thing. So I tried to find the thinnest filament around. I even tried experimenting with different kinds of hairs. That didn't work either. But then I found something that did work, something we all had in our homes in 1879, which was the year I was working on this experiment or this project, and many of us didn't even realize it. Sewing thread. Now, as we know, cotton thread is not a conductor of electricity. It's what's the word I'm thinking of? It's not the opposite of a conductor. It's not a conductor. It's insulator. Thank you. I'm getting a little old there, forgetting things. But yes, it's an insulator. It's not a conductor. So we had to cover it with a conductor. That conductor was carbon. We had a source of carbon in our laboratories, a source of carbon that all of us had in our homes in 1879. After all, how did we make light in our homes in the evening? Oil lamps. Well, when the oil lamps were finished burning, there was always this residue of lamp black or tar at the end. Most people just took it and just discarded it. I collected it. We placed it in a furnace with the cotton thread, heated it up together, and the thread became carbonized. Now electricity could glow through it at a hot temperature. But the problem is, you expose it to air, it combusts. Well, what does fire need in order to combust? It needs oxygen. It needs air. So we decided to remove the air and place it inside a glass bulb or a tube. And to remove the air, we created a vacuum by using a mercury Stengel pump, which got all of the air out. It had to be not 99% right. We got it down to the nearest thousandth of a percent. And after 8,000 experiments, we made our breakthrough on October 21st, 1879, when my electric lamp glowed for 40 hours, nearly 2 days. And the only reason it went out, we turned up the voltage. And I realized we had what we wanted, a low-energy, high-resistant electric lamp. And in subsequent tests, it would glow for 100 hours, 1,000 hours. I knew we had made a breakthrough. Why, that Christmas and New Year's of 1879 and 1880, we had a display of electrical lighting down in our laboratory at Menlo Park, and people came from miles around to see our great display of electrical lighting. And as we entered a new decade, this would be the decade of electricity. By September of 1882, we had built and opened up the Pearl Street Power Plant in New York City. The first time an entire square mile of any city was totally powered by electricity. Now, of course, the type of power we were using was direct current. That was the only known way at the time, and I believe the safest way at the time. I had also started my first electrical company. It was the Edison General Electric Light Company. And anyone who wanted to work in the field of electricity would come and work for me. Well, one day in 1884, a young man came from Europe. He had a letter from Charles Batchelor. Oh, I should explain, Charles Batchelor, or Batch as I like to call him, he was my right-hand man. He actually did a lot of drew up a lot of the plans for a lot of my inventions. This young man had met Batch over in Paris, and Batch had given him a letter of introduction to me. The letter said, "There are two brilliant men in this world. You are one, and this young man is the other. His name was Nikola Tesla, and he turned out to be the best darn electrician I ever had. A brilliant man, an outstanding electrician. But he had these ideas about alternating current. I knew a little bit about it. I knew it required hundreds and thousands and even millions or more volts that he claimed could travel over farther distances with more effectively. But I thought, no. Using so much voltage, I felt that was dangerous. It could harm and possibly kill people. And I told him, Tesla, don't talk to me about this alternating current. But if you can improve my generators, there's $50,000 in it for you. Well, you know what happened? He did it. He improved my generators and expected me to pay him the $50,000. I said, Tesla, you don't understand our American sense of humor. So he left me, and then in 1887, just 2 or 3 years later, he invented the alternating current generator that he sold to my competitor, George Westinghouse. Now Edison DC was in competition with Westinghouse AC, and I felt I had to warn the public about the dangers of alternating current. So you know what we did? We built our own AC generator right here in West Orange. It could produce about 1,000 volts of electricity. We paid children to bring in stray animals, and in front of reporters we would demonstrate by electrocuting those animals. Well, after all, I would say to them, look what it does to those poor animals. Just think what it will do to you in your home or your business. Well, the reporters then asked me, well, Mr. Edison, you've proven that, but you haven't proven how it will kill a human being. I had a wonderful idea. An electric chair to execute prisoners. And it would work on Westinghouse alternating current. We invented it, and through a third party sold it to the New York State Prison at Sing Sing. And it was there that the first prisoner was executed by using our electric chair using Westinghouse alternating current. I even told reporters before he was going to be executed that this prisoner would die, but would be Westinghoused to death in the electric chair. Well, it worked. So did alternating current. And then some of my investors staged a hostile merger with a rival electric company, which made me a minority stockholder in Edison General Electric Light. Well, by this point, I was tired of all these electrical wars. I didn't want to hear anything about it. So I sold my stock, and that was the end. And I had nothing to do with electricity after that. Oh, and you know what they did with my electric company? They renamed Edison General Electric Light Company General Electric. And then at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, it was Westinghouse who got the electrical contract, and his star performer was none other than Dr. Tesla. But they had to use Edison electric lamps for that. But now let me tell you, and I'll tell you something about Tesla. Do you know in 1912 there were stories printed in the newspapers that Tesla and I were to receive the Nobel Prize in Physics? Do you know he rejected it? He said, if you're going to award a scientific prize, you award it to a scientist, which he is. He's a great scientist. And of course, he says, well, after all, he's trying to say that I'm not. It's true, I'm not a scientist. I'm applied research. I take other people's ideas and put it into practical commercial use. But, we were so busy with so many other things. We were building telegraphic equipment. We were building phonographs. And in 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered the X-ray. So we began to work on it here at the Edison Laboratory, and I invented a machine, a screen for the X-ray known as the fluoroscope. It is the only invention I never patented because I wanted to donate it to mankind. Oh, I even came up with an idea of putting a little phonograph inside a doll to make the world's first talking doll. And we were working on all sorts of things. And then I had an idea. In northern New Jersey, there were all these low-grade abandoned ore mines from the time of the late 18th century, from the time after the Revolutionary War. And I thought, we could mine a fortune from that. So I invented the magnetic ore separator that would separate ore or low-grade ore from rocks and dirt. we bought up these old mines, and I invented a whole process to mine and separate the ore from the rocks and the dirt. We spent 10 years and $3 million on it. The problem was they were able to get better and higher grade ore from the West and Midwest. So we lost that money, but I had a good time. But I'll tell you, I had a good time doing it. I enjoyed myself doing it. Just think, $3 million, and I spent only $24,000 developing motion pictures. Now, where did I get that idea? Well, of course, we had photography since 1839. The problem was there was no way to create the illusion of movement. Well, I got an inspiration from a famous photographer of the 19th century. His name was Edward Muybridge. He was famous for photographing people and animals in different positions of motion. In 1878, two men in California had made a bet of whether a horse has all four hooves off the ground when it gallops. One of them happened to be the former governor of the state. He started that university south of San Francisco in Palo Alto. It's named after him. Oh, yes, Stanford. Leland Stanford was his name. So they made a bet. They got a racetrack, they hired Mr. Muybridge, and they set up a series of cameras along the racetrack. Now, you have to remember at this time, cameras only photographed one frame or one image at a time. So they set up the cameras with the string connected to the shutter. So when the horse galloped by, it would photograph the horse in different positions of movement. Well, when they were finished, they discovered that, yes, the horse had all four hooves off the ground at once. It was also the first time that any living creature had been photographed in consecutive positions of movement. The problem was there was no way to create the illusion of movement. So in 1888, I filed for a caveat, that is an intention to invent something called the kinetoscope. I said it would do for the eye what the phonograph did for the ear, create a series of motion pictures. Now, at first, I tried to base it upon the phonograph using discs, rotating discs, but that only gave us very limited results. And the other problem was, until the 1880s, photographs were taken on single glass plates. Well, a good friend of mine in Rochester, New York, by the name of George Eastman, found a way to photograph on a strip of film, where you could take one photograph after another on a strip of film. Well, I contacted George and his company. I'm sure you all use it for your camera film, Kodak. I said, George, send me some film strips, but I need you to cut it down to about this wide, 1 3/8 inches or 35 millimeters wide. Now, instead of photographing one frame at a time like you did, say, with a Brownie camera, what we would do is shoot between 16 and 24 frames per second. We added perforated holes to the side, and then we threaded it through a machine that I will show you, called the kinetoscope. What we did was, we threaded the film around the spools. On the spools were sprockets that would turn the film through the machine like a conveyor belt. People would go into an arcade, drop a coin into the slot, it would activate a light and a motor, and then they could watch the motion picture go by. We had these on the market by 1894. And then by the end of the decade, we found a way to project it onto walls and screens, and people began to go to these 5-cent theaters that became known as the Nickelodeon. Now, outside, you might have noticed I have a rotating tar paper building. That is the world's first motion picture studio. It is known as the Black Maria. Now, why do we rotate it? Well, what we have is we have an opening on the top, a little sunroof that opens up so the light can shine down on the performers when we photograph them, and we can rotate the building during the day as the position of the sun changes. And in 1903, we actually photographed the first motion picture to tell a story called The Great Train Robbery, a Western that we filmed right here in West Orange. Now we were entering a new century, and we had a new form of transportation. It was called the automobile. Now, the problem with the automobile is it used a gasoline-powered engine, which was noisy and emitted a lot of smoke. And I thought, well, can't we find a nice, clean, quiet way to power an automobile? Why can't we use electricity? Well, the problem is we had to find a battery that could do it. The problem is most batteries at that time were heavy, they leaked acid, and were usually impossible to recharge. So I thought to myself, you know what I'll do? I'll come up with a light rechargeable battery. So we spent 10 years and 50,000 experiments to come up with the rechargeable or storage battery. I remember when I was working on that, and one day we'd been working on it, doing thousands of experiments, and a reporter asked me, after we had failed thousands of times, he asked me, "Mr. Edison, what have you gotten out of those thousands of failures?" You know what I told him? I've gotten lots of results. I know thousands of things that don't work. Well, that's how I do everything. Trial and error and process of elimination. When I want to discover something, I read what everybody else has done, and then I make thousands of more experiments. Well, by 1910, 1911, we had perfected the rechargeable or storage battery. And we were actually able to make a series of cars using that. The problem is that gasoline-powered engines could make an automobile go faster and travel farther. But we had other uses for the storage battery. It could be used on miner lamps, in submarines, on train signals. It had so many other great uses. And of course, by 1914, I remember we had a big fire at our laboratory in West Orange. I remember that the day that night it happened, I told my son Charles, "You better get your mother. She's never going to see another fire like this." But of course, that was the year that the Great War broke out in Europe, or some of you are now calling it the World War. Of course, we were not involved with it, not yet, not until 1917, but already President Wilson was concerned about our defense needs. So he asked me to head a committee to look in our defense needs. And I was shocked and surprised when I made my report. I said, you know why the Germans are doing very well? They utilize their science and industry together to produce weapons. So at my insistence, the United States government set up the first laboratory to research weapons for development, the first naval weapons research laboratory, which was started at my insistence to research and to produce weapons for our nation's defense. Now, as you know, of course, we entered the war in 1917. Now, remember when the war did break out in Europe in 1914, a reporter asked me why I thought war had broken out, and I told him why. I said, well, look who's behind German finance and industry. You know what you find, don't you? A Jew. But I meant that as a compliment. I told Jacob Schiff I was only praising his people's talents. Why, I want to invent something so useful, a Polish Jew will buy it. No, but don't misunderstand me. I want to tell you about a fine colored gentleman who worked for me, a credit to his race, Louis Latimer. He is the son of runaway slaves, and he perfected the filaments for my electric lamp. So when you look at that, you remember a colored man did that. Now, of course, the war started giving me an idea. I realized that if there is another international conflict, we could be cut off from sources of rubber. After all, we're now a nation on wheels, and where do we get the rubber for our tires? It's all imported from the Dutch East Indies, Brazil and South America, and Central West Africa. And if there's an international war, we could be cut off from those sources. So down at my winter home in Fort Myers, Florida, I began to experiment on trying to find an alternative source of rubber. Now, I knew that every plant had a certain extract of rubber, so I invented a machine that could actually do that. And I brought in plants from all over the world to find out which would grow best in Florida, that we could grow right here in the continental United States. Well, from my experiments, I found out the plant that had the best extract of rubber was from goldenrod. Had about a 20 or 25% extract. I invented a machine that could actually extract the rubber from that. And my good friend Harvey Firestone made a pair of tires using that process. Now, I've mentioned to you people like Harvey Firestone, I've mentioned George Eastman, and over the years I've gotten to know many inventors and many other industrialists. I recall traveling to California in 1915 and meeting the great botanist Luther Burbank. But of all these men, there's one I remember who I became most friendly with. I don't remember the first time I met him, but he later reminded me. He said it was back in 1896 when I was visiting the Detroit Edison plant in Michigan. And I was introduced to a young man who was its electrical engineer. And this young man had told me that he had been working on and had invented his own self-starting automobile. And he wanted my opinion of what he should do and my advice on what he should do. I told him, young man, you just stick with it, you just stick with it. Well, he stuck with it and he did quite well. I think you all know whom I'm talking about, Henry Ford. And Henry and I become good friends over the years. Well, I told you about that big fire we had in 1914. He immediately advanced me money to start rebuilding. He even built his winter home next door to mine down in Fort Myers, Florida. And over the years, we've taken camping trips together along with Harvey Firestone, John Burroughs the naturalist, while even President Harding joined us at one of those occasions. But one of the things I'll never forget, I'll always be grateful for Henry for, is preserving the past. I know Henry once said all history is bunk, but nobody did a greater job of preserving the past than Henry Ford. Why, just 2 years ago in 1929, he took the remains of my laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, as well as Sarah Jordan's boarding house, which was across the street from our laboratory. He reconstructed that near his home in Dearborn, Michigan, along with a courthouse where Abraham Lincoln practiced law, the bicycle shop where the Wright brothers worked on inventing the airplane, Noah Webster's home, and so many other historical sites. Recreated him there in Dearborn, Michigan, at a site that he would call he called it Greenfield Village. And in October of 1929, he invited me and Mrs. Edison to join him and Mrs. Ford, as well as President and Mrs. Hoover, at the dedication of Greenfield Village. And when he brought me into the reconstructed Menlo Park laboratory, he asked me, well, Mr. Edison, how does it look? I looked around and I said to him, well, Henry, I think you got it about 99% right. He was worried about that 1%. I assured him that we never had the place this clean. But when I was there, I was reunited with an old assistant of mine, Francis Gell. He had been 18 years old back in 1879 when we worked on the electric incandescent lamp. And together, for a national radio audience, we recreated the invention of the electric incandescent lamp. Now, over the years, people have asked me, Mr. Edison, to invent all these things, it must require a lot of genius. Well, I'm going to tell you what true genius is. 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Thank you very much. What was my biggest roadblock? Roadblock as far as what? You mean to inventing? Well, you know, the only limit we ever have with anything is our stomachs, because the body can only, the stomach can only hold so much food. But as far as man's mind, we can continue inventing. Many times, the thing about inventing that I've learned is actually, it's not so much I come up with an original idea as I continue where other people left off, and other people have continued where I left off. Did my family benefit from the invention of the light bulb? Well, no more or less than I did. Actually, they've taken an evaluation of my assets at this time in 1931, and my assets are about $12 million. That includes, you see, eventually I lost control of the electric company. Actually, I don't think most of you folks realize at some point I actually lost control of my 3 most famous inventions. I mentioned the electric lamp. Phonographs, we stopped making them in 1929. Edison phonographs. And motion pictures, well, I saw them more as an educational tool than as an entertainment tool. And by the mid-1910s, I stopped producing motion pictures. Meantime, some other men who tried to undercut me, we know what they did? They went out west to California so they could get away from my control, and they started filming motion pictures in some ranch near Los Angeles called Hollywood. What advice I would give to any current inventor? persistence. Just keep at it. That's one of the things I learned about inventing is stick to it, is just stick to it. That's probably because so many times people have given up so easily when they've been coming so close to actually achieving their goals. Which inventions have I enjoyed the most? Well, my favorite invention was the phonograph. It was the most original one because nobody else had been working on it. All the other things I'd been, well, I mentioned you the telephone. Now, I don't know if you're aware, 3 of us were working on it at the same time. Alexander Graham Bell, Elisha Gray, that was the third man. Mr. Gray, I don't know if you're aware, applied for a patent the same day as Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell's application came in first. But no, I've enjoyed the phonograph. I felt it's one of my greatest inventions. I said nobody else had been working on that. And however, I saw the phonograph as a business machine. I'm sure many of you use that as a dictation machine in your offices. That's how I envisioned the phonograph. And some people said to me that I should record music on it, and I told them it's not a toy. Well, when I began to get competition for the phonograph, I decided to open up a recording studio, which we have right here in West Orange, until 2 years ago, and we were recording and producing phonographs. Well, you say the phonograph uses a needle and now it doesn't. Well, then how do you play the phonograph? With a what? A light? Young man, that's a wonderful idea. You come and work for me and we'll invent that idea. Any regrets? No, none really. I'm very satisfied with what I've done. As I said, I've made and lost fortunes, but I enjoy doing it. The important thing is I enjoy working on my work. Was I motivated by doing things financially, or would it be good for the country? Well, both. I wanted to make money, and if I invent something that makes money, I can make more inventions that can benefit the nation as well as the world. Was I doing anything when I was involved with telegraphy? Did I do anything with Marconi? Well, Marconi, of course, what he came up with was the wireless telegraph. What many of you call radio was actually sending signals through the air. Yes, I was even experimenting with that in the 1880s and 1890s. And Marconi took many of those ideas and applied it to what you now call the radio. My personal life suffer? I don't know if it suffered. I just spend a lot of time here at the laboratory, and my dearest Billy takes care of things at home. I try to be a good father and try to be a good husband, but as I said, I told you about my mistress, work. Did we make money on the electric chair? I hope we did. And I'm sure we made our point with it. Was Henry Ford difficult to work with because of his poor reading skills? Well, I got along very well with Henry. We're both self-made, self-educated men. I think we had a lot in common. I never had a problem with him. He always looked up to me and respected me. He told me I was his inspiration.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.